blood spatter expert Tom Bevel was asked to analyze the blood drops found in the Routier home. As co-author of a well-known textbook on blood pattern analysis, it was Bevel's job to interpret the story told by the blood trail. Bevel noticed the blood drops on the kitchen floor were circular in shape, meaning they were deposited by someone standing still or walking very slowly. Darlie said she was stabbed on the sofa and while bleeding ran through the kitchen after her assailant. But running would have produced blood drops more elliptical in shape, usually with a tail indicating the path and direction of the person running. Darlie also told police that the intruder dropped the knife onto the kitchen floor, but Tom Bevel could find no evidence of that.
It's Sully Jones, and today we have Mystery Maverick with us on Kitchen Table Research, where we do the research so you don't have to. We do have a library of photos. Our social media is listed. You can find us under Kitchen Table Research Podcast on Facebook. Our Instagram is kitchen.table.research, and our Gmail is kitchen.table.research@gmail.com. The link to our bio, our website, is in our TikTok and in our Instagram and in our Facebook, but you can find all of the information in all of those places. So today we're actually getting into episode 9 of the Darlie series, and we're going to be talking about DNA today. And that's why we wanted to get Mystery Maverick, because here in a second, I'll let her plug herself. But if you want to continue following us, for going into season 2, we're going to move all of our subscriptions over to TikTok and post and kind of have our TikTok as our main channel. So you can find us under @Marcus, Marcus, the THE Bunny, BUNNY, and my name Sully should pop up and you should see all my true crime there. I have done some visual experiments that we're going to talk about today that you can see there. Go ahead, Mystery Maverick, and tell us who you are and what you do. And how did you get into the Darlie case?
Hi everyone, my name's Tara. I have a channel on YouTube called Mystery Maverick, where I do docu-series on true crime. I got into true crime many years ago. As a result, when I was very young, I studied applied forensic science in college, and then I went on to university and I studied psychology with criminology. So I've always been interested in true crime from a really young age, quite disturbingly young age. Yeah, so once I got my degree, I did a lot of research, and one of the cases I came across many years, even I think it may have been before I even started at college, was the Darlie Routier case. And when I first heard about it, the only thing I saw was a documentary called Forensic Files. And after watching that, I said she's guilty in my head. And what convinced me was the luminol testing. Once I saw the luminol testing in the documentary, I just thought, oh, what a terrible woman, she's guilty. And then I didn't think anything more of it, and I went about my life. And then a few years later, I happened upon a book called Hush Little Babies by Don Davis on the case, and it made me think twice, because after reading the whole book from start to finish, I just thought there's something not quite right here. And that prompted me to research the case myself. And by this time, I was, in uni. And by that time, I was really interested in crime, criminal behaviour. And so I looked into it myself and I started reading all the transcripts. I managed to get a copy of the book by Chris Brown with all the crime scene photos in. And I started researching it myself, and everything that I came across and everything that I researched, everything that I studied in the case, told me more and more that Darlie was innocent and that something had gone horribly wrong with her case. And in my opinion, it started from day one. It started from the minute, the police were on the scene. I think it really started when James Cron came to the crime scene, but I now believe Darlie's 100% innocent from everything that I've researched. Through the episodes on my channel, I will be showing why I think she's innocent and what the evidence actually says about what happened that night.
Well, and I just want to state tomorrow, I'm not sure if Tara is going to be on it because Rich, who is a PI that also is kind of in our group, he has a podcast on YouTube called, it's under RJP, and he does Darlie episodes. And episode 61, we will be talking about the forensic files. So if it's not out when you hear this, it should be coming out shortly. So you can look at Rich's work and you can look at Tara's work on their YouTubes. And I just want to state that we met you guys, I don't know, I met you maybe 8 months ago, Rich 6 months ago. You guys came to the same conclusion that our team did separately.
Yeah, well, it's not difficult once you look at the evidence to come to that conclusion. If you ignore the evidence, or if you just go along with what the prosecution says about the evidence, then I can see why you would think differently. But if you really dig into the evidence and you read all the transcripts, you would come to the same conclusion.
Danelle, who is Darlie Routier's baby sister, also speaks candidly about the case and answers questions on her TikTok. And her TikTok is at Fugate, Fugate 1982. So again, at Fugate, Fugate 1982. So you can go follow all of us on TikTok and all of us on YouTube. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to Jones, and she is going to get us started.
So, Michelle McNamara, who was in the middle of writing a book about the Golden State Killer, and she was found dead one night, so she didn't get to complete her book. But this is a quote from her book, and it's as if she is addressing the Golden State Killer. If you commit murder, you being the Golden State Killer, if you commit murder and then vanish, what you leave behind isn't just pain, but absence, a supreme blankness that triumphs over everything else. The unidentified murderer is always twisting a doorknob behind a door that never opens. But his power evaporates the moment we know him. We learn his banal secrets. We watch as he's led, shackled and sweaty, into a brightly lit courtroom, as someone seated several feet higher peers down unsmiling, raps a gavel, and speaks at long last every syllable of his birth name. And thanks to Mystery Maverick and Ridge Prater for their expertise and answering my questions, their contributions to this episode. These DNA reports are both difficult to read and difficult to interpret. If anybody understands or knows more than me, please challenge my conclusions. Let's start with exhibits A, B, and C. These exhibits we will be discussing are available on the Darlie Facts website and through a search of the internet. I just looked those up last week. They are still out in the internet world. Mystery Maverick and myself pored over these exhibits, interpreting the oftentimes confusing conclusions and summaries written by the various DNA experts. There are several reports from the Southwest Institute of Forensic Science, that's known as SWIFS, the Texas Department of Public Safety, known as the DPS, and the North Texas University Department for Human Identification, known as NTU. It is unknown whether the same person who runs the tests in each facility is the same person who writes the summary reports, and whether the testing was then confirmed by another unbiased person. Is there a checks and balance system for the evidence collected? Did the technicians know it was Routier evidence, or was the identity of the evidence unknown to the DNA technician? Because 3 different agencies handled, examined, and reported on forensic evidence collected from the crime scene, you can see immediately that all the reports are going to be in different formats by different people with different skill sets. And that is the first flaw that I find in this confusing maze and conundrum of evidence.
So I wanted to point out that I think that the tests were the reports were written by the people who carried out the tests. I say this because they're signed by the person, and also because they testified at trial and they were asked several questions that indicate that they was asked several questions that indicated that they had written the reports, because they was asked, did they match the samples on their reports to specific like exhibits, like the T-shirt, for instance, Darlie's nightgown. But I don't believe they knew some of. I think Caroline Van Winkle, one of the people that testified, I don't think that she necessarily knew whereabouts in the crime scene they were from, but they did all know who, and that's been something that's been brought up in DNA testing in more generally, is that they should do blind testing to, because it would help, take the bias, because there's still research bias, there's still analyzer bias in DNA, even though DNA is seen as quite a scientific approach to forensics. Obviously it's one of the best things we can get at a crime scene is DNA, but at the same time there's still an observational bias by the person that is looking at the sections of DNA. So whoever's reading the analysis, there can still be bias in that. So they suggest that to do blind testing, so that analysts aren't aware of whose DNA they are testing.
And we will have some questions that are going to pop up when we do start talking about some of the DNA and how it was collected. I can go in and tell you about some of the blood experiments that you guys know that I did.
Exhibit A material was collected by Swift days after the crime, but the summary was reported on November the 1st, 1996. Exhibit A lists those items that were collected in the first weeks after the murders. Those items included the window screen, window, outside garage door, knife swabbings from the garage floor, kitchen sink, bedding from the Roman room, sections of the carpet, samples from the sofa that Darlie was sleeping on, the vacuum cleaner from the kitchen. They further collected several throw rugs, but neglected to collect the rug outside the utility room. They also neglected to collect the baseball cap in the utility room. However, this was collected some weeks later, and a rag that was touching Devon's hand at the crime scene Results determined from Exhibit A revealed Routier's DNA on these items that were collected. However, there were no reported Routier family DNA on the window screen, the window glass or frame on the garage door. I think maybe one of you guys should say this bit.
So we have talked about the collection of the DNA and how and who collected what. If you go back and listen to, I believe they're in episode 6 and 7 where we dive into the forensics and we went down the forensic chart. So if you're listening to this episode and you haven't listened to those previous episodes, you might want to get caught up, or some of this might not make sense in context. So we do know that there were fingerprints that were collected on some of the surfaces along the window frame. And of course, we still have one of the smoking guns in this case, which is 85J. That was an unknown fingerprint that was left on the coffee table in Darlie's blood. Subsequently, it's never been determined, as we know, to match anyone. It's not a full print, as we talked about when we did the fingerprint part of the series. It's not a full fingerprint, but I believe three, Tara, experts have ruled out that it was anyone inside of the Routier home's fingerprint.
Sorry, they have, but also during Darlie's appeals, the prosecution, well, the state had an expert who excluded everyone, all the apart from possibly maybe it could be Darlie's left ring finger or
Which,
right ring finger.
which wouldn't really make sense that just her ring finger would have touched there. You know what I mean?
Yeah, and and also you have to bear in mind that the state at your appeals, the state are trying to
Keep you in
um
jail.
stop your appeals.
Yeah.
Yeah, so
Initially, the expert at Swift's decided it was Darlie's fingerprint. And then, as Gene Screen and other people came in to analyze those same results, they decided it was not Darlie's fingerprint. And there was a glob of blood on that coffee table, and then the fingerprints on top of it. So it's like it's almost two separate events. It's not like the fingerprints smeared around in a glob of blood. It's the fingerprint is on top of the blood.
I mean, to
So
me, it proves that the killer left his fingerprint in Darlie's blood.
I think that's I think that's much more likely than Darlie smearing her fingerprint and then three experts afterwards deciding that no, that wasn't Darlie's print, that it was an unknown fingerprint.
Yeah, there's still some controversy about that fingerprint.
Yeah, because I think they've decided
and
that's not
there's no
Darlie's.
blood spatter, there's no blood dripping or anything. Darlie was bleeding by this
Right,
time,
Right, so it
like
right.
would have
quite
been in her
profusely.
low
There was
velocity blood splatter that this fingerprint gets left.
Mm-hmm.
right,
If in fact
and
she left it.
there should have been other, you know, blood dripping
Or other
around
fingerprints
that
next
finger.
to it. You know, if she
Right.
put her hand down on the table, but just to catch a ring finger, especially just the side of it, would, to me, I've just not seen another case where that's the fingerprint that the court
Convict.
uses. Yeah, it's always been most of the time
And
your
what allows
index or your
yeah.
thumbs, because those are the fingers that we use mostly as tools. Even pinkies, ring fingers, and middle fingers, I just don't find as likely.
Yeah, I agree. And also, you know, they could say that because they didn't take the boys' prints to see if it was the boys. They didn't take Darlie's print, and they barely even mentioned the fingerprint at trial. It became like a, you know, it was one of the most important things in the case. If you ask any detective, any investigator, any for like forensic analyst, anyone, if you ask anyone in the field, if you had a bloody fingerprint at a crime scene, That would be that's your star piece of
Well,
evidence.
Right, that's a smoking gun, in my opinion. But the
And
prosecution
also
and the
what they
state has just
also
tried to bury it.
yeah, they tried to bury it at trial, and also they did not try and match. They did not try hard enough, in my opinion, or at all, as we see from the DNA testing, because there's no blood samples of it. But we see from the photos that there is a hand mark on the utility room door, which is the exit, is the exit of the intruder. I mean, that would be the place to look
Well, and
or take evidence, even though some say it was smeared. But apparently they had use of luminol. So if they had use of luminol, they could have sprayed the door. They didn't even take photos of the back of the door where there's another fingerprint that goes round the door, um, as if someone's holding on, as if someone's grabbed the door with their hand. And yeah, quite frankly, if they were using luminol, they could have the main place I would have used it on would be that door, because that's the exit, and it's too high up to be any of the boys' bloody fingerprint. And even if it wasn't that visible, luminol would have shown a clearer fingerprint. And also, luminol does not destroy DNA or blood. So what you get is once you've done the luminol, you can then take blood samples. But I've seen no evidence anywhere in any report that I've seen that those samples were tested.
I agree. And actually, after I did my experiments with the bovine hearts and blood, I went through and luminoled my own crime scene. So when you see the quote unquote pictures of what some people believe is luminol, which one of them is a picture of the kitchen sink, well, there's a purple baby bottle in there. You're seeing the reflection of that. To the untrained eye, some people believe that that's luminol testing. That, in fact, they did not do. They state that they did luminol in the kitchen, but I don't believe they did because, A, in my opinion, if she would have slit her throat over the sink, they would have picked up the cast off with the luminol around the sink. Tara helped me put some of the photos together of what real luminol test site looks like. And I do have a video of the luminol testing. And then, as Tara was stating, why did they not luminol the entire garage, including that door, including the utility room, which is where the intruder would have left? And they also state that they luminoled the couch, the green couch. So there was like a couch that Darlie was sleeping on in the love seat. So the police did take that couch into custody, and they state at the scene, while it's still at the scene, that there is Damon's handprint in blood on the sofa. But they say that they couldn't get a picture of it because after they luminoled it the first time, they quote unquote didn't get a picture. But as Tara is stating, luminol doesn't destroy evidence. So luminol, the more you do it, the lighter and lighter it gets. But they didn't have black lights, they didn't have the lights turned off. There is not one single photo I have ever found. And Tara, I feel like you are gonna advocate this, but I have not seen one photo of any real luminol testing done, in my opinion. I don't think they luminoled anything. The luminol proves that Darlie didn't do it, so that's why they didn't want to use that evidence. So,
No, I haven't seen one
no.
photo, not one, ever. And
Yeah,
I believe me, I thought that she was guilty because of the luminol
right.
from the forensic file. So that was the first thing I was that was the first thing I was looking for, because I was like, well, if she's innocent, then how did, the sink light up like a Christmas tree? So
And
I
and like I
was
said, that picture, and I'll post it up on our social media, but that is not a picture of luminol. That is just a reflection of the baby bottle off of this
with the
silver
baby bottle
sink.
in the sink
Yeah.
and really poor. photography, can I just add, really
Yeah, we've
bad.
already said that
Almost
at least 100
intentionally,
times in this series. So the
but
photographs were
but
bad.
yeah, but at least I don't know, I feel like they were intentionally bad
Me too.
because just the way that some of the photos, if you look at the maroon pillow, for instance, it's intentionally cut off. You see like the bottom end of the pillow
Right.
and there's like blood running down it, but
And
yet
that's
there was no
supposedly where
blood on
Darlie
the
was
pillow.
attacked. So you would think that
Right,
would
and
get photographed
that's the pillow
well.
she slept on.
Right.
Yeah.
And that's where Damon was laying right underneath her, and they just don't have any good photos because again, I agree with Tara. I just think that they did shoddy work on purpose because they had closed their case and they closed it by using Darlie instead of looking for an intruder.
And because their evidence didn't match what they were saying, had to somehow sort of play it down.
And we've already gotten into Patterson and that he was a narcotics, detective, and this was one of his first homicide cases. And did was Patterson dirty and was he involved? We've already kind of talked about that, so just keep that in the back of your mind when we're talking about how poorly evidence is collected, and was there an ulterior motive, as Tara is stating, thinking
I
about.
mean, Patterson, he didn't do anything. He didn't do
Well, and then
anything.
he pleads the fifth on
He
the stand.
he literally didn't do anything.
Yeah.
He's a lead investigator with pretty much zero involvement in the case.
And then
Didn't
he does
take any notes.
answer like a few questions. I mean, he has some testimony, but it gets to a point where,
Yeah,
yeah,
before he takes the fifth. Yeah,
yes. And then right behind him, the his right hand man, Chris Frosch, who again we've already talked about, then goes ahead and pleads the fifth right after him. And why did the prosecution not call up Patterson as the main
yeah.
investigator? Why did the defense have to call him up? Because the prosecution knew that if they called Jimmy to the stand, it was not going to look good for them, in my opinion.
Right, and just another thing about that, just in the same vein, that basically they didn't. There was a lot of people who were crucial to the case that didn't even testify. One of the doctors that operated on Darlie
Right.
didn't testify. The guy who supposedly did the luminol testing
Right.
that no one's ever seen, David Neighbours,
Neighbors,
um,
yep.
he was he was the lead crime scene officer at the department. So he didn't even testify. But James Cron, a consultant who wasn't a lead, do you see what I mean? He was just a consultant. He's like a hired help, basically. He testified as if he was the lead investigator and he was the lead crime scene. The way that it was handled was just, it's like nothing I've ever seen before.
It
I
is
mean, usually
shocking.
the lead investigator has the authority and and everything else to he should be speaking with like the crime scene techs, he should be speaking with witnesses, he should be speaking with he
He
should
should
be
be writing
speaking with
reports.
everyone. He should be writing reports along with everything else that he didn't do. He should be following leads. He should be delegating.
Yeah.
Um, and so if you're like if you're the lead investigator, you need to delegate to the crime scene techs like what you want collected and based on your experience of being a lead investigator. I mean, you watch any show, watch what's his name, Joe Kender. Is it Joe Kender? Watch a show. Does he say, "Oh yeah, I was just like twiddling my thumbs in the office," and
No.
like
Right.
he
And
speaks to people, he looks at the crime scene. Do you see what I mean? It's like this whole crime scene. the evidence collection, everything was a shambles.
I mean, if we
And
want to be real, it's
for a
just a cluster. It's a cluster F.
yeah, because for a lead crime scene officer, so someone that's in charge of a crime scene, to not testify. But yet this guy, he goes on national TV all the time saying that Darlie should die and he can't wait for her to die and he'll be he'll be there. It's like, well, you didn't turn up at the trial, so maybe you should not show up. Do you see what I mean? He wants to show up for, like, those reasons, but he didn't
Right.
wanna show his face in trial and sit there and
Well, and he wanted
say
to
what he found and what he did.
plant, the grayly illegal slash not really illegal wiretap. He wanted to do that. You know what I mean? But then, like
Right,
Tara's saying, and we've talked about this in previous episodes. Joe Kenda is an excellent example, but Paul Hull, same way. You grid out a crime scene. You don't pick and choose what evidence you're going to test. And I think Tara kind of hit on that when she's talking about the door and doing luminol. You grid that garage off in or
mm,
whatever room, the utility room, and you grid it off. And when you take samples from that grid, then with photos, you can go back to the grid and match it up perfectly. We don't have that
yeah.
ability in this case.
I mean, I don't wanna, like, deceive people. You can't collect everything at a crime scene.
And a crime scene doesn't happen in a vacuum. There's
But
going to be
it has to
contamination. Right.
be systematic, and you have to collect what's important, and you do have to pick and choose in a way. You do have to say,
Right.
"That might not be so important, but this might be more important." But the the people taking photos and collecting evidence, they're not deciding.
Right.
They shouldn't be deciding what they're
Right.
doing. I mean, we've got evidence here of the towel that I just mentioned that was collected some weeks after next to Devon's hand. The I believe it was Maine. It was David Maine.
Maine.
It was David Maine that initially started the whole evidence collection. But he said in trial that he didn't think that a white towel with blood on it next to the hand of a victim was not important. He
Well,
didn't
because
think
that
it was
goes against their
important.
theory that there was no life saving measures taken. Yet we can see rags
Right,
all
but
over
who
the
told him
case.
who told it wasn't his job to decide
Right.
whether it was important or not? This is what I'm saying. They were just sort of let loose, like, individually around the crime scene.
It was like kids in a
No
candy
one
shop.
was yeah, no one was, like, supervising this.
Yeah. Yeah. People are just kind of all over the
And
place.
and even Charles Lynch testified that he came back with Catherine Long because he said to himself, "Well, the police probably haven't collected anything, they probably haven't collected hairs and fibres and stuff like that." So he even said to himself, "Oh, I'll go and see what else there is," because he didn't have much confidence clearly in the Rowlett Police Department. But yeah, so who's telling him that's not important, don't collect that towel? Do you see what I mean? There was no one there supervising that. He's just collecting stuff. There's no tags on evidence, so you can't see where in relation to another piece of evidence that something is. There's no photographs of a wide view, so like a bird's eye view, like you should have photos of each corner from each corner of the
Well, they
room so
could
you
have
can
stood
see
on the
the
stairs.
whole entire crime scene. Right, but they just took weird, strange pictures that were like cut off, half cut off, and
Yeah.
with no flash, and like so you couldn't see anything. And that's why a lot of times, like, because I've studied it so much, I know where everything is and where a piece of evidence is. I know from looking at it what angle it's from and where it would have been at the crime scene. But a lot of people don't know that, and they get mistaken because the Routiers had like the two sofas, and they had three glass tables. So they had a higher one behind the table, which was the one with the bloody fingerprint on, which was on the sofa that, not the sofa that Darlie slept on. It was the other sofa. Then they had a glass table in the centre of the room. They also had a glass table at the end of Darlie's couch as well. So the way they take the photos is difficult. That part of the sofa where her head was, and I'm like, no, that's the other sofa that was at the
Right.
other side. So it can be very difficult to piece together or reconstruct a crime scene when, the documentation of the crime scene's so poor.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't want to keep going on about the terrible
Well,
photos because
actually, no, that leads us into our next great point, which is let's go back to the forensic DNA in this case. And when Mulder, this report comes out, what, the day of trial? The defense
Se-
gets the DNA?
Second day of trial,
yeah.
yeah.
Yeah,
So
okay.
it was the 7th of January.
Yeah,
Yeah,
7th.
7th of January. By this time, the defense had not even seen most of the evidence.
Correct.
So
nor could they
they're literally
hire,
at trial.
yeah, nor could they then go hire a DNA expert to testify.
Right.
They don't
And
have
that was
the
one of
time.
that was one of the biggest mistakes that the
Yeah,
defense made. Not only that they didn't have other experts to discredit the experts that were there, but another major one is that they didn't do any of their own DNA testing.
yeah,
Only going to test what they want to test, and then all you're left with is what the prosecution wants you to see.
right.
Right. I think Swift's is a sub is a sub jurisdiction for the police departments in Dallas. I think everything was sent to Swift's initially. And so it comes back as the perp. And then, since it corroborates what they already think they know, then that just works. Because I don't know who requested gene screen to come up with the second DNA or the third DNA. Did somebody suggest that? Did the
And those
defense ask
happen in the
for that?
appeals for all of our listeners.
No, some of them
Some of them are
happen.
from the original trial gene screen.
Yeah, the
Okay.
second one, that
Yeah, and
second one,
they are all those ones are all from Gene Screen, the original.
right, right,
Um, and what happened is that they were trying to find more evidence, particularly on the
right,
shirt. They was trying to find more evidence of the boy's blood. And so they kept testing and testing and testing it because they couldn't find they had, very minimal, which we'll be discussing, but they tested the shirt so much because it didn't help them in any way. Do you see what I mean? It
And we'll
wasn't
definitely get into
very
that shirt.
convincing.
Yeah. Yeah. So I think the question is, Tara's made some great points. Jones has made some great points. We know that the defense didn't have the resources that they need when they head into Darlie's original trial in January of 1997. And so this raises a lot of questions like, was there a second knife? Because when we talk about the knife, and I think we talked about this in our more forensic episode 6 or 7, but they took 4 samples off of the knife. Now, I believe they have taken more samples off of the knife since then or have requested to. I'm not quite sure. But Devon's blood is never found on the murder weapon. And that raises a lot of questions, including, was there a second knife used? Was there a second intruder? And we have talked about a second intruder theory before. So again, it just goes back to it being a very shoddy collection of evidence. So we're kind of left with that.
So continuing with Exhibit A, Swift then used an amplification technique with a polymarker test to tease further DNA from the samples Each Routier is amplified into 4 separate DQ alleles. That proves that the boys were indeed the children of Darlie and Darren. The sock retrieved from the alley is identified as Devon's blood, with no other family members identified at that time. The knife includes both the hilt and the blade, and only 4 areas were tested. Damon and Darlie's DNA are revealed, but not Devon's DNA. Why would that be? If Darlie killed her children, why is there none of Devon's blood on the knife? Only 4 samples were obtained from the knife, but the entire knife was not examined. That raises the question of, was there a second knife, perhaps not found, with a second perp involved? Was it shoddy collection of evidence? Who knows? We have to also take into account here that they did only take 4 samples, so it could indeed be not thorough testing. But then when we look, when we see these samples that were taken, Carolyn Van Winkle, who actually testified to this analysis, said that she only received samples from the knife. So someone else had already collected those samples. They decided, we want to take 1 sample from here, 1 sample from here, 1 sample from there. And she was given the samples. She was never given the actual knife to test. So yeah, we do have to bear that in mind as well, that this is kind of cherry picking, because obviously, as I said before, you only get a picture of the prosecution, what the prosecution wants to test. And therefore, her analysis was based on the 4 samples that she'd been given that were already selected for her. Exhibit A details Swift's using a technique of RFLP, which reveals DNA banding patterns of significance. There was not a DNA banding pattern of an outside family member obtained on any other sample, but using the banding technique on a larger stain on the sock now reveals both Damon and Devon's blood.
Well, and I think that's really interesting because, as I think you stated, Devon is the biggest contributor of blood on the sock exhibit, yet we don't see Devon's banding pattern on the murder weapon.
Right. And that's probably, is such a juxtaposition
Yeah,
that it does lead you to think that if there's no blood of Devon's found on the knife, but Devon's a major contributor to the blood on the sock, it also helps to reinforce that idea of, was it 2 intruders?
right. Or
Was there
two
2 different
weapons.
weapons
Right.
or 2 weapons?
Or did, and this is kind of going into conspiracy, but did they find Devon's blood on that knife? But if they did, that would have just solidified more of the prosecution if they would have found Devon's blood on the knife. So
Yeah,
it
if
doesn't
they'd have
make
found Devon's blood on that knife, they would have used it.
yeah,
No, there's no doubt about that.
right, because it would have shown that it was only one contributor, or like one person holding one knife. That plays more into that theory. But for Devon's blood to not be on that knife, and again, what did they luminol the knife? The four points of testing, that's not a very large test sample when you have a knife that's what, at least, let's say, 6 to 8 inches between the
Right.
hilt and the blade, and you just take 4 pieces of DNA, or 4 samples. That knife was not luminol. There could have been tiny specks that just were not picked up by the original testing.
And um if you look at the picture, the photos of the knife, a lot of the blood got on the knife from Darlie's arm wound when she
Right.
picked the knife up to put it on the side. So you see a lot of dripping at the top, at the blunt edge of the blade. You see like a blood dripping downwards, meaning that
Right.
she did exactly what she said she did. She picked up the knife.
Wound on her right arm, it would have bled just straight down her hand, straight down the knife.
Right. And also, we see that there's none of Devon's blood or Damon's blood on the light switch that she touched or
I did
the
actually
knife
want to point that
handle.
out. We know that, well, we know that at least, and if you want to say Darlie did it, you can think about it in your own head, but in our research, Darlie's blood is on that light switch, and she confirms that she did turn that light on after she picked the knife up. And again, I want to reinforce the fact that if I was a mother and this had happened to me, I probably would, and my 5-year-old, as Darlie stated, Damon kind of was starting to follow her into the kitchen, which we can see is true by the blood patterns. If my young child was following me into the kitchen, I would have picked that knife up out of habit too. Not only that, but then you're
Right,
taking it away from that intruder. So it's not weird that she touched the knife. And again, we've stated this a million times. And the 911 call, people say, well, she readily admits, oh, well, I already picked the murder weapon up. Well, that question was prompted to her 2 times by the dispatcher.
right. And
Okay.
also people completely ignore the fact that Darlie was in a horrific
Shock.
situation.
Shock.
She was in shock. She'd just woken up. This horrific thing had happened that was not expected. It's not, you don't expect to wake up with all this going on.
No.
She woke up. And also, yes, so also she wasn't just only in shock, but she was talking to several people at the same time. She was talking to the 911 operator. She was talking to Waddle when he got there.
Mm-hmm.
She was talking to Darren. She was talking to her babies because she was saying to Damon, "Hold
Hold
on,
on,
honey, be strong," even though she never helped him apparently,
quote
but
unquote.
you can hear her. Yeah. So it's like,
And she's talking to the
you know,
dispatcher.
you don't know what Waddle's asking her. You don't know, do you see what I mean? And she's talking, so what I think happened, and you can sort of hear it in the 911 call, is that Waddle asked her something. She was sort of vaguely explaining to him, and then the operator said, "There's a knife, don't touch anything."
Right.
And
She's having
then
like
then
3 conversations at once.
Yeah, so she was having a conversation. She said, "Oh, there was a knife over there," and it sounds like she was saying that to Waddle.
Right.
And then once the operator overhears what she's saying to the officer, and you've got to remember the operator at this time didn't even know the officer was
Right.
there because he wasn't called to the scene. He
Right.
just overheard it on the radio.
And we've talked
So
about that.
she was none, and he didn't even call it in and say, "I'm on my way there," or anything.
And remember, he's responding to an unknown medical emergency. That's what it comes across as. The dispatcher says, unknown
Right.
medical emergency. To me, as a last responder, even though I still get those calls because, if they don't make it, then last responders get called in. I would think, well, oh my gosh, at 2 a.m. in this nice house in Rowlett, where Waddell is sitting just blocks away from in the church parking lot, I'd think, well, somebody had a heart attack. Not that I need to be on the look for an
Yeah.
intruder or that a crime has occurred. He's thinking an unknown medical emergency. And honestly, that's probably why he didn't call back in to 911.
Right. So maybe he just went there thinking it wasn't as,
Right.
dramatic,
Severe.
it wasn't as severe as it was. So yeah, that's also a possibility. But yeah, I don't I think that you'd be a bit smarter if it was you that did it. If Darlie did do it, she's not going to tell them she picked up the knife. Do you see what I
And
mean?
she,
If
to me,
you
I
can
would
look at
have,
it both ways.
why did she not just wait until both children were dead until calling 911? Because it would have only taken a few more
If she did
minutes.
do it, she could have washed that knife off. She could have stuck it back in the thing. Do you see what I mean? Like she
Yeah.
could have. There's things. Well,
And then, like we
she probably would
stated,
still have
going
her
back,
blood on it. But
yeah, and then going back to the light switch, we know she turned the lights on because her blood is on the light switch. So we know that the crime happened in the dark. Why would she have not had the lights on the whole time if you were going to commit,
right.
you know? Let's move on to another piece of evidence, which is very important to this case because this is one of the things that Darlie was actually arrested on. So the grand jury got handed down, of course, the docket or the case, and they review it. And two of the pieces of evidence that Darlie was originally arrested on was a hair, a blonde hair that was found in the screen, and fibers that were found on the bread knife. So let's get into that. A hair received from the window screen was declared by James Cron as Darlie's hair, and that finding was one of the reasons he deduced so quickly that, quote, Darlie did this. Once the hair underwent DNA analysis, however, it came back not to Darlie, but rather a police officer's wife. Either she or he was on that scene, and he secondarily transferred her hair onto the scene. So Cron was not correct on his assumption. This discounts the prosecutor's theory of Darlie leaving a strand of her own hair as she cut or came through the window screen after planting the sock down the alley. Subsequent reporting does mention the hair was actually ID'd as a policewoman from the Rowlett PD as Officer Sarah Jones. This is one of two pieces of evidence, as I stated, used by the grand jury to arrest or for the prosecution or the police to write her arrest warrant. In previous episodes, we've already talked about this hair used by the grand jury to indict Darlie. And the second piece is a fiber that was found on the bread knife. We've talked about the possibility of the quote unquote fiber being from fingerprinting because the screen was fingerprinted before the bread knives were fingerprinted. However, you will see in the trial that the prosecution denies that and states that it was a, sterile collection of the knives. But let's state that even a piece of screen is transferred onto the bread knife. Well, in my opinion, because I've reenacted this scene several times, including when I had all of the blood evidence going, and what if the intruder took the bread knife out of the block thinking that it was the largest knife in there? I do that all the time. I have a knife block and I constantly pull out the serrated knife because I'm just looking for the biggest chopping knife when I'm cooking. So, I mean, he could have pulled that out, even put his finger on it, looked at it, and said, no, this is not a good, weapon, and then pulled out the secondary knife, which would have been the what they call butcher knife or the murder weapon. That's easily plausible. So Exhibit B summary reported is dated December 2nd of 1996. This again comes from a Gene Screen report, but was collected in the fall of 1996. There are some of the same items which were included in Exhibit A, which we spoke about, and some new items. Different amplification methods were used to tease out any new DNA of significance, and that was of the toe of the sock that now revealed that Darlie's epithelial cells were on the toe of the sock. Now, epithelial cells can slough off from skin. They can also be from mucosal membranes like inside the mouth. So some can argue that Darlie just carrying the sock down could have left her epithelial cells, but it's more so in our opinion that those cells came from inside of the mouth. So the t-shirt also reveals Darlie's DNA, except for a small stain attributed to both children. So there is some blood of Damon's on the front right of the shirt, and there are two specific drops that Bevel testifies to that belong to Devin on the right back shoulder area of Darlie's t-shirt. Now, Bevel's going to state that these two drops got there from Darlie swinging the knife back over her head. Although, as you see in my experiments, you lose control and you lose terminal velocity when you swing the knife all the way back over. And even if she did swing the knife all the way back over her shoulder, that terminal velocity would have splattered the blood splatter about 12 to 24 inches behind Darlie when I did my experiments. And I will tell you how I think those two blood droplets got there. So we'll get into that in a second. So the t-shirt reveals, like I said, Darlie's DNA. There's some of Damon's I believe, and Devon's mixed into the front. Is that correct, Tara?
That's correct.
Okay. The two pins on the back that we're going to
There's
really
only
talk
one.
about. One.
There's only
Okay.
one.
One
There's
drop
one drop of blood.
that's about the size of a pinhead. And so, this again, this piece of evidence kind of corroborates Darlie's story. It shows that she gave some first aid to the children, but neither of the child's blood is really on her shirt. There's pieces here and there from maybe Darlie doing CPR. Darren applied the CPR, but Darlie stated that she bent over Devon's body and helped closed one of the, what do you want to call it, stab wounds closed so that Darren could try to perform CPR. And did her hair get into Devon's blood and then transfer onto the back of the shirt? Because I can corroborate that and repeat that experiment over and over and over again. And my hair was about the same length as Darlie's when I did these experiments. And if I were to bend over and get my hair in the blood and then carry on and my hair swings back, or you push your hair back over the back of your shoulder, that could have left Devon's blood right there where Bevel finds it.
But we also know that Darlie's blood was found where Damon originally was, on the sofa where she said she slept, and Damon's blood was there, obviously. And then we also know that Darlie's blood was on Devon's pillow and around Devon. So we know that she must have been bleeding, actively bleeding when she went to these locations or
Because
was at those
they're like
locations.
mixed together. Like Darlie's blood on the front is underneath. I can't remember if it's Devon or Damon's, but they're mixed together. So they are concurrently bleeding, or Darlie is the first bleeder.
Right. So she wouldn't, why she couldn't have stabbed herself and then stabbed them, because that's just crazy.
Well, and the
She couldn't
blood
have done it
evidence
after
doesn't
she
show
was
that either. It shows
right.
that,
And it doesn't show that she stood by the sink the whole time tending to her own wound,
Oh, and
as
actually, as you
Officer
state
Waddle
that,
states.
before I forget, we've already talked about the sofa that she was laying on. If you go look at the t-shirt, and of course you can find this on Darlie Facts, and you can also find it on my Marcus the Bunny TikTok, where I did have some of my experiments on there. The blood goes back, drips back over her shoulder. So if she was
Right.
standing up at
She
the
was lying
sink,
down.
right, if she was standing up at the sink and had cut herself while she was standing vertically, it would have been vertical drippage. Now, if she was laying horizontal, the way that she actually states she was laying, with her left shoulder kind of placed further into the couch and her right shoulder kind of hanging out or being more exposed, that's another option. When Devon was stabbed, did a piece
Yeah.
of microscopic blood get on Darlie's shoulder at
That,
that point? That blood went back over her shoulder. She had to have been laying horizontally for the blood to have dripped that way. So really go look at
cool.
that shirt, and the left shoulder and the right shoulder are really important pieces of evidence. And as I stated, that blood would have had to have dripped. She would have had to have been laying horizontally for that horizontal drippage.
Right. And there's so little of the boy's blood. It's hard to say, yeah, this is from stabbing them anyway. I mean, the one on the back of the nightshirt is particularly troubling because it's the size of a pinhead. It's not near any other blood on the shirt either, which I find
Right.
quite
And you
quite
can see where the
interesting.
shirt was actually folded, and we've talked about this and the chain of custody. That shirt got folded and thrown in the bottom of a brown paper bag. It was not laid out to dry, it was not hung up to dry, and so there's a lot of transfer contamination along
Right.
with,
And I al- and I always remind people that, because they're like, oh, how else did the blood get on her shirt? Well, she was next to them. She was right next to them from the knife that that the perpetrator was using.
because Devon's head was right kind of perpendicular to Darlie's. Devon was
Yeah, his
parallel.
leg. his feet were facing Darlie's head, basically.
So, as we stated, if the murderer is swinging that knife around, that terminal velocity is going to go about 12 to 24 inches back. So, it is plausible that as he's
Yeah.
stabbing
And
Devin, that the
and
backwards cast off is
if
hitting.
you believe like if you believe like I believe that Devon got up and went to go and walk towards his mum, which I show in one of my videos, that Devon was found laying the opposite way to how he had fallen asleep that night, because he'd fallen asleep facing the television and his pillow was facing the television. Now he was found adjacent to the pillow, so he literally had done like a quarter turn round with his feet facing towards Darlie. Like, I believe that he got up and went to her, then he was even closer to her than we know. Do you see what I mean?
Exactly.
When
And
he was stabbed.
when you pointed that out to me, another big point that you pointed out is that Devin and we everybody's kind of is in agreement that Damon did get up and walk, but a lot of people think that Devin just laid there. He was murdered and laid. But
Right.
as Tara stating, not only is he his body position is different, but he has vertical drippage down his bottom half of his body and some of the clothing he was wearing. His Power Man
Yeah.
pajamas have vertical drippage, which shows to me he at least sat up. Now, did he sit up and then fall a different direction?
I believe it's too I just think it's too, saturated for that. The
Yeah.
blood on his the blood on his undergarments, that it's too saturated for him to have just sort of leaned up.
Or leaned
And
up due to
also,
thrashing. It's way
right,
too, yeah,
I do
saturated.
feel like he got up. I didn't know Devon personally, but I've spoken to many people who knew him, and he was a very lively kid, a very boisterous
He
kid.
would have fought back. Like he would have fought back, in my
I feel
opinion.
like I feel like he may have gone to try and protect his mum, and that's when he was attacked. But yeah, everyone says Damon was very quiet, very introverted. But then Damon, it's a different scenario because he was sleeping on his front, so he was vulnerable to it in that way, that he couldn't fight even if he would have. Do you see what I mean? But a lot of people say that he was very sort of introverted, so I
Right.
doubt he would have
Fought back
done
as
the same
hard.
as Devon, but I do believe that Devon would have,
And he was a little older. He
got
was
up,
almost
tried to protect
7.
his mum.
Right.
Right,
Whereas Damon's 5. He's face down. He's not in a position to defend himself.
right. And
Um,
there's reports that a lot of older kids used to hang around with Devon because he was like that. He was more
he was the
like, not
protector
mature. I don't wanna
of
say
Damon
mature for a
too,
kid,
and
but do you
Drake.
know what I mean?
He was like the big brother. He was like the big brother of of Damon, who was just a year and a half or so younger than him, and to baby Drake. He was the big brother. He
Right,
was the protector. Yeah.
right.
Okay,
But
well,
yeah, I do believe that he got up, and if that is the case, then, he was at the right angle for, any cast off to hit Darlie because
right.
of where he
Right.
ended up. I think that he survived long, don't get me wrong, but I think he might have heard and
Yeah.
then woke up and tried to go over to her.
Devin was hit in a pulmonary. He was hit in a major artery, so he would have bled out faster than Damon because
Which
Damon
is
was
another
stabbed more.
reason, his
Mhm.
stab wounds are another reason why I don't think that he was lying down, because it just doesn't make sense that he was lying down. If you look
Yes.
at the angle of the stab wounds,
You did a
the
really
cross
good job
section.
of showing the cross sections in your last podcast. So, if this is interesting to you guys, go watch Mystery Maverick's last episode. She goes in and shows you all of the cross angles and in which directionality the knife would have been coming from. And some of those almost prove that Devin had to have been vertical.
Just by the angle, because you wouldn't, if someone was lying down, you would just need to stab them straight on, surely. Like, how Bevel depicts that you would, no, not actually, no one would stab anyone like that, because that's just ridiculous. You'd have to sort of be like leaning over and just stab straight down, and actually you would get like,
Well, you
you
have
would,
more
because
control
there
over
was
the
no,
weapon
you
when it's closer to
right,
your
and
body and you're not.
and you'd get a downwards deviation, because if you're stabbing someone and they're lying down, you're leaning over them, the knife would pull back on you. So the blade of the knife will pull back
Right.
on you.
And again, you kind of lose control of the weapon then.
Yeah. So, but if the blade of the knife pulls back on you, you would have a downward deviation in the cut. And they testified there was no up or down
Right.
deviation
Right.
in the cuts,
That's even in the
and they went
autopsy report.
from left to right,
Mhm.
left to right with no up or down deviation. So that to me indicates someone's like stabbing
Parallel.
out at an angle
Right.
parallel, yeah, to your body, or even just sort of, yeah, like sideways. If the person had come at him from the sideways, which makes sense because Darlie was on the sofa, you would come at that angle and you would end up, like you said, it's going in a right angle. So you would be stabbing. You just wouldn't. It just wouldn't be.
It just doesn't make sense.
I'm not. It just doesn't make sense. It wouldn't be comfortable.
No.
Not saying that stabbing someone's comfortable, but like it wouldn't be.
You wouldn't be in control of the
It
situation.
wouldn't be practical. Yeah,
Practical. Yeah.
It just wouldn't be practical to do that. And you would have to, like I showed in my video, Darlie would have had to twist her body right round. So she would have had to twist her body over to the left side to get that stab angle, which like just makes no sense if someone's lying down. It just, yeah, like I said, you would just stab like straight on, like from above. There would be no need to
Well, and I think
stab
that it's really interesting.
that.
And I'm going to just state this before we get into the next piece of evidence, which is her panties that she was supposedly wearing that night. But you just mentioned, if you look at the blood map and you try and compare that to the not well documented crime scene photos, you can follow Darlie around because her right arm is dripping low velocity blood. So when she states that she picks the knife up off of the utility room, you can see an arc around where she would have picked the knife up, turned around, and you can see that turn. And so we can kind of follow Darlie, and as you follow her through the house, the blood that the low velocity blood dripping off, particularly her right arm, we can follow her around, and we might not know in which order, but it does basically, her movements do corroborate her story. Do you have anything you want to add to that
I,
before we go to the panties?
yeah, I agree. I just agree with you, because it's like when you follow the blood evidence, when you see the DNA, when you map out the DNA at the crime scene, you'll see that it supports her story, and in fact it doesn't corroborate the
No.
prosecution's story at all.
And some people say
You
that
know, we
Darlie's story changes. I don't think it changes. I think that it gets more detailed as she starts to remember things. And I also think
right.
some
I
people
don't
say, well, at first I was struggling with him on the couch. Okay, then she states, oh, well, now I see him at the end of the bar. Well, I think that she was struggling with him at the couch and she was
right,
unconscious for a number of seconds at least because
right,
Damon is the one who woke her up, according to Darlie. So I do
right.
think she
I
fought
believe
with
she
him
was
on the
like knocked
sofa.
out. Yeah,
Yeah, me
she either
too.
faint from when you have your throat slit.
Yeah, or just
You
shock.
can faint.
Or just
Yeah,
kind of be out of it in shock. Like, oh, like, it's like getting I mean, I think a
yeah,
comparison that we can all maybe relate to a little more is like getting the air punched out of you. Like, it just takes you a
Right.
second to just kind of,
And
whew.
also another thing we've got to take into account is that we don't have all these different versions because no one took any notes. No one wrote any reports. The one person who took notes that interviewed her at the hospital was Chris Frosh, the second in command. He took the fifth. So
Right,
we didn't get to ask, they didn't get to say, what did she say to you? This was all from Patterson, and this was everything we know from that interview at the hospital is from Patterson's the halls of his memory. So
right.
we don't actually know what she said.
And she was on
Um,
anesthesia. She was waking up after surgery on anesthesia and
right
on other
after and
medications. And we've already
yeah,
talked, we
after an
have
hour
already
and
touched about that.
15
Yeah.
minutes on anesthesia, plus she was given medication just before that, and then they're speaking to her. So yeah, it's like you said. So even if she did say whatever to them at that time, it's going to be different because she's on medications. She's just been through this horrific ordeal. I mean, I don't know. I feel like if your story's the same, it indicates rehearsal, that you've
Right,
rehearsed it and it's
right.
fake. It's not a real story.
Every time you tell a story, you're going to tell it a little bit differently. And I think something that the general audience can maybe relate to again is, like, have you ever been in a car wreck where at first you just kind of really don't remember anything, you're in shock, and then, even if you go to the hospital and then go home, more stuff starts coming back to you as you start remembering, like,
Even on a psychological level, we see that we see how bad memory is in general. Memory is not, people think that, it's a tape recorder and,
it's
something
linear.
happens and we get the information in. This is how they originally thought it was before they knew anything about memory. When they first started researching memory, they thought that it was like there's information, you retrieve that you get that information from the environment or wherever. It goes in and then it's stored in this little box, and then it's retrieved whenever you need it. Now everyone knows, like, even on a human level, a practical level, like you was just saying, you cannot have a car crash and you can walk into the next room and wonder why the hell you walked into that room, but you knew there was something in that room
Are we
that you
getting to
want
that
that you
age?
needed.
I'm at that age where I walk into a room and don't remember what I'm getting. Yeah, I mean,
Right.
we know that memory is very faulty. And like you're saying, it gets stored in this quote unquote box in your brain. Every time you go retrieve a memory, you're not retrieving the original memory. You're actually retrieving the last time you thought about it.
Right,
Psychological.
and also your memories are also built on perception, on bias,
Yes.
on there's many things that come into it. And when we look at trauma, like memory and trauma,
Oh, yeah.
it's even more complex
And we just talked about
because,
traumatic amnesia in our last episode. So,
yeah,
yeah.
and it's even more complex than just normal everyday memory, because with traumatic amnesia, you may remember smells or how you felt and things like that, but you might not necessarily remember events that were
Right. And I
going
know
on.
sometimes when they are trying to bring somebody back to a memory, they do use smell, because smell is one of the most, whenever you walk into your grandparents' house, that smell, you immediately are like, that's, you associate,
Right.
smell is one of the most associated things to memory, which a lot of people don't.
And sometimes you block those out because if
Right.
they're traumatic enough,
It's the
you
brain's way of
you would block
protecting
that
itself.
out, because why would you wanna keep reliving horrific trauma
Right.
over and over again?
Exactly.
So sometimes your memory just completely says, "Look, I'm gonna protect you from this, and we're not gonna remember the details." So
Exactly. We did talk about her panties. We know that her panties are missing. I have corroborated that with Darlie. She was absolutely wearing underwear that night. She said because she was laying downstairs in the Roman room and doing movie night with her kids. She said that she had on the shirt, which is actually a Victoria's Secret nightshirt with a pair of white, kind of frilly, boy shorty kind of underwear. That was a set from Victoria's Secret, and she did have both pieces on. Her underwear to this day has never been found. And again, I just want to shout out RJ Peace podcast again, because if you like this episode, you will like his episode number 61 on the forensic files, and I will be speaking on that one. So, Darlie's neck and arm wounds were on the right side of her body. So, Darlie is right handed. Again, we've already stated this. If she self inflicted the arm wound first, she would not have been able to bend her right wrist into a position to stab her own forearm. And with that wound hurting, it would have also been really difficult to then slice her own neck open with her non-dominant hand. My right arm is a quite bit stronger than my left arm, as I am right dominant. So could she have even left-handedly caused her own right-sided wounds? And this is something that Dr. DeMaio, who is in my opinion a much better trained pathologist than either of the two MEs, what were their names?
Joni McLean
And
and Janice Townsend
Townsend.
Parchment.
Dr. DeMaio, he's a much, I would say, much more critically acclaimed academic pathologist than either of the other two MEs. They were much younger. They had not done homicide studies and had not gotten to the degree of pathology that Dr. DeMaio was at. And a lot of people don't even want to look at or talk about Dr. DeMaio's testimony, because he basically states if Darlie had ended up on my table, meaning his mortuary slab, if she would have ended up on my table, he said I would have ruled her death a homicide.
Right. And he also said that he states what I've always stated is that you don't change hands when you're
Right.
inflicting self-inflicted injuries, because it's nothing to do with, oh, you know it well, it's partly to do with the fact that your dominant hand is stronger, but it's more to do with the fact that you just it's automatic, it's subconscious, it's not, you don't think, "Oh, I'm gonna pick this up with this hand and that hand." Do
I
you see
mean,
what I
if
mean?
she would
It's
have
the subconscious.
premeditated this, she's one of the smartest women I've ever known, because a lot of times if something like this happens, she would have written down what she was going to do in a journal. Like, I need to do this first. I need to do that first. I need to get this piece. And, a lot of times we find like killers' shopping lists or how they're going to do things, or nothing like that is ever, you know, like I said, Darlie committed this crime in the dark and then happens to turn, we see that her blood is on the light switch. Like, make that make sense. It just
But we
doesn't.
see but we see in other cases, the reason, and this is what Dr. DeMayo explains in his testimony as well. We see in other cases that people that have been caught for, trying to throw off police, or, trying to, pretend that they are the victim. When we see things like that, or look at Diane Downs, we see she was caught because she used her dominant hand, and it's because you don't think about it. You don't, it's not a process that you think about. You don't think about, oh, it's like me saying, when you get up, you don't necessarily think, I'm gonna get up now. Do you see what I mean? You just do it because it's an automatic process. It's one of
Right.
those things that's like, it's built into us so that we can live life and not have to.
Right.
Do you see what I
You don't
mean?
think
So we
about
can just.
breathing. You don't think about, like you said, in the middle
Right,
of the night, you're
exactly.
like, okay, I have to pee. You're not like, first, I need to take my left leg out and put it on the floor.
Of the bed, yeah, that's what I'm
Right.
saying. You just don't think of it like that because it just doesn't occur to you. It's literally like an automatic thing that you do. And like I said, with Diane Downs, and even DeMayo said that he's had professionals, doctors, and I think was a dentist, and like very like professional people. that have tried to get away with something like this and failed to do so for that very fact is that they use their dominant hand.
Right. But
Because
again, Darlie shows no signs of premeditation, and I want to hit on something you said about Diane Downs. A lot of people says Darlie Routier is just another Diane Downs. No, Diane Downs she has been diagnosed with several mental disorders,
disorders.
whereas Darlie has never been. Did she have some postpartum depression? Maybe we could have diagnosed her with some of that. She did not have postpartum psychosis. We know that for a fact, diagnostically. And since she's been on death row for 27 years, she's never been diagnosed with any sort of condition like that. She is not Diane Downs.
Right.
They are two separate people, two separate crimes that had
Yeah.
two separate motives.
Also, at trial, they proved it because Lisa Clayton was the psychiatrist who had actually visited Darlie, and she said and she actually studied under Dr. Resnick, who is like the leading
Leading,
founder.
yeah.
He's like the founder
Didn't
of
Clayton,
filicide research. Yes, Lisa Clayton studied under him.
and
So,
she's the one that stated that she felt that it was safe enough for Drake to stay in the Routier home with Darren.
right, she said that she doesn't believe that any filicide motive is, relevant to Darlie at all.
All right, well, on that note, we're going to get through Exhibit C, and I'm going to hand it back over to you, Tara. And it starts with Exhibit C was a further summary report.
Exhibit C was the new DNA from gene screen, and the summary report dated January the 7th, 1997, was faxed to Kerrville courtroom shortly after the trial began. It caused a bit of an uproar as to who got to see it first. Exhibit C reveals two new pieces of information. A pinpoint of Devon's blood is found on Darlie's back left shoulder of the t shirt, mixed with a pinpoint of Damon's blood. Darlie's blood is overlaid on top of the boy's pinpoints. Those findings sure don't support Mr. Bevel's testimony of spatter evidence that occurred as Darlie raised the knife over her head when she was stabbing the boys. A facial hair and the root and shaft of a pubic hair show up in the inventory report and were recovered from the Roman room. Charles Lynch from Swift's hand-delivered the hairs to Gene Screen. The facial hair is from a person unknown to the Routiers, and I wonder whether it was identified as a beard hair, which would indicate male. Even though the pubic hairs were received, there are no available results, and I don't think the defence was even aware of these hairs were collected as evidence at the time of their retrieval. Remember, DNA analysis was a brand new science. Neither prosecution or defense had vast experience understanding DNA testing. And Mulder, defense attorney, had only a few weeks to review the data and construct the crime for a jury. And he spent Christmas holiday in Hawaii. We suggest that neither side understood how relevant DNA evidence would be to the case. Exhibit D is a letter from Gene Screen dated October the 20th, 2004, and is 7 years after the last known report. A sentence states there are DNA extracts still remaining in our possession for the extracted samples, some of which are dehydrated but still viable, except for the hair extracts which were consumed. That is such a convoluted statement that I do not understand whether there still remains DNA or not, particularly as it relates to the pubic hair, although the hair extracts should be still viable for further testing. Exhibit E, dated October the 19th, 2004, from the Rowlett Police states that the police have the jeans worn by Darren and collected by Captain Jimmy Patterson, the lead investigator on the night of the murder. The RPD did not collect the coffee table as evidence that night and does not have the coffee table in their possession at present time. A family member states that the coffee table was never returned to the family and no one knows where it is currently located. The Rowlett PD did not collect the glass table behind the north couch in the Roman room. A family member states that the table was never returned to the family and no one knows where it is currently located. An unidentified fingerprint, Prosecutor's Exhibit 85J, came from this table. This fingerprint could have been critical in identifying an intruder. Mitochondrial DNA differs from the traditional DNA found inside the cell nucleus. It's found in separate organelles that exist outside the cell wall within the cytoplasm, whereas nuclear DNA contains 23 chromosomes from each parent. Mitochondrial DNA is passed down solely through the maternal lineage. It's not fully understood why, but paternal lineage is thought to be destroyed during fertilization. Mitochondrial DNA testing could be useful in Darlie's case, as firstly, it would help in ruling Darlie and the boys out of the samples, and secondly, by identifying an unknown perpetrator or perpetrator's own family lineage, which could further help in the future use of investigative genealogy to find a perpetrator.
In late 2004 and early 2005, motions for discovery were filed and finally granted in court to re-examine both pretrial and post-trial evidence for further DNA collection results. Those motions are documents that give reasons the evidence should be examined or re-examined for the first time. Also included are the exhibits as we discussed earlier in this podcast. Also used to give reasons for the retesting is, quote, the Johnson report. Elizabeth Johnson is a DNA expert who was retained by Darlie's team, although I cannot find a written document that reports the results from the Johnson report. There are referenced reports for 2010 and 2011 as identified on the University of North Texas report, which our team has not been able to locate. But I do believe they might be the mitochondrial submissions, and as of today, we don't know those results. The report from June 17th, 2015 is also from UNT, and that report examines whether the samples include a YSTR finding, which would indicate male DNA. The report states that no testing was done on the extracts. What? Does that mean the pubic hairs mentioned in Exhibit D, and why? There are some YSTR reports on the t-shirt, and those are Devin and Damon's pinpoint spots. Some of my thoughts. There were multiple people who collected evidence at the Routier home and office. Every DNA testing facility has a different numbering identification system for evidence received at a testing facility and the results made available. Also, even though some inference can be made from the reports, not all of the reports have legends and indexes that accompany those reports. In addition, various agencies retained some evidence. On a list of evidence, even though vacuums were collected, there are no indications that the debris from the vacuum cleaner bags were collected, and there is no indication that any DNA was tested from the vacuum cleaner bags. Where is the male DNA for the missing 2015 report? There was some cocaine and marijuana smoking paraphernalia collected from the master bedroom. Why was that not tested for fingerprints, especially since drugs and murder are often associated? Again, there's a discovery dated for pretrial DNA that mentions the Johnson report, and we've never seen the Johnson report. A diffuse stain on the sock and the lower back of the shirt list a Y-strand chromosome, but they don't exclude Darren, and neither is it definitive for Darren. Does that make sense to y'all?
Really
They
just
would,
not a useful piece of evidence.
it wasn't a use other than the fact that it was male.
So there is a male Y, and we've talked about YSTR DNA when we did the yogurt shop murders in Austin, and we also did cover a little bit of DNA. I think that it's on the end of our Carla Faye Tucker episode. YSTR only comes from a male. So it's basically stating that there is male DNA found, but we can't rule Darren out. Correct?
Correct.
Okay,
Correct.
I get that. Jones and Tara have both discussed DNA quite prevalently throughout this episode. So I just want to restate that we have taken this information. There are DNA summary reports stated as follows, and these are not to be confused with actual collection dates because the collection date is clearly different than when the lab gets a hold of the information and tests it. So, if you want to go look at our resources, there is from November 1st, 1996, an Exhibit A from Swifts, December 2nd, 1996, Exhibit B, Gene Screen, also known as the Orchid Cell Mark. January 7th, 1997, they received Exhibit C from Gene Screen. October 20th of 2004, I believe this is during Darlie's first appeal. We then get into Exhibit D, Gene Screen. Then we have the UNT report from August 20th, 2010, and the UNT report from July 2011. And those are the reports that we cannot find. My question to you, Tara, is do you think that the Innocence Project has retained that information so the public cannot see it?
Do you mean the missing report that was 2015?
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, what I believe to be true is that because I actually had a copy of that report. I'm not sure whether it's on my old laptop. I haven't been able to find it, but I did have an actual copy of that whole lab report. And what I believe happened is they were leaked online, and the judge had the files closed. That's my understanding of the situation. Anyway, is that the judge sealed the records. Obviously, all the other records was already out then, but I think the judge sealed the records. This was during another appeal process.
So there's a report from 2010 and 2011, and then the one that Tara was just talking about is from 2015. So the one from 2015 is the one we believe has been sealed.
I think they've all been sealed. The ones that I say that we can't find, I think those have been sealed now. And
Right.
I think
Right.
that the Johnson report was a part of that information in those reports. And it also has been sealed because it's a part of those sealed reports.
I was going to say, I just think that maybe there is something there for the Innocence Project to use if Darlie does go into another appeal or goes for a straight out
Exoneration.
exoneration, right? And so maybe there's information in there, although Oztur has stated they were leaked, but I think that's why they were sealed. So I think
Yeah,
we
they
kind of
were
all
Right.
agree
quickly
there.
taken down. Just to mention that report actually has unknown male DNA. It was from, I believe it was from a hair. So, and it has unknown male DNA. It wasn't Darren's and it's not Darlie's. That's what the report says in it.
Well, and the reason that's so important is that if it's unknown male DNA, we know that all the policemen were tested. We know that the house was cleaned the day of, so we don't expect to find any male DNA. So the very
Right.
fact that there's unknown male DNA that was recovered tells us that somebody was in that house that wasn't
Right.
a
And in
male was in that house.
addition to that, it was mitochondrial DNA testing that they used for that sample.
And I think that we spoke about the crime scene and that the reason that we think this male profile is so important, and I think we did hit on it, but just to reaffirm. First of all, they had cleaned that day, and that area had been vacuumed where the
Right.
crime scene was.
And they
Um,
didn't test the vacuum bag.
they didn't test the vacuum bag. And so for there to be unknown male DNA that doesn't match any of the police officers or anybody else in that house, like I said, the crime scene was cleaned and this DNA is showing up in the crime scene. It's not like this weird DNA was found up in the master bedroom. This is found
Right.
underneath the couch where Damon and Darlie were attacked.
Right.
I
And
didn't know that's where it was found.
yes, it was found but where kind of Damon was laying, and he was again parallel to Darlie, and so they collected that pubic hair and the shaft and the root, the facial hair from that area. So it's on the crime scene. You know what I mean? Like that's a pretty big indicator for me. And whenever you spoke
Right.
about, I want to go back and talk about the drugs that were found in the house. And I'm not judging anybody. Darlie and Darren were adults. Whatever they did, on a Saturday night when the kids weren't there was their business. But the only reason that I wished that they would have processed the drugs and possibly whatever bag they were being held in is, could they have matched fingerprints or DNA off that baggie to find who sold the alleged drugs to Darren? You know what I mean? I don't care that there's a little bit of
No, I
cocaine and
don't care either,
marijuana
but
in the
yes, they should
house.
have done that. And again, I mean, there's a definite link between drugs and murder, and they should have investigated that angle more, in my opinion.
Well, and a reason that I think that they didn't is because, as we have stated, Patterson was known to be, I mean, he came from narcotics. Chad Patterson has been looked at, his son in this case, and we've talked about Chad Patterson in previous episodes, but did Jimmy Patterson not want that drug bag collected? Because it could have tied Chad or even Patterson or somebody that was in that ring back to the crime scene?
Certainly a possibility.
And I also wonder, speaking about the police kind of not being on top of things, when Tara was talking about the table, the jury was not sure which table they were talking about in relation to the crime scene. Now, did the prosecution present that confusingly on purpose? Or were they inept?
Well, and Mulder didn't challenge it.
Exactly. I do think comparing this case to the Golden State Killer is really interesting because we started this episode with a quote from Michelle McNamara, who wrote the book on the Golden State Killer and investigated it kind of in the same way that Kitchen Table and Mystery Maverick and some of our other groups have investigated the Darlie case. And you know what? If Michelle McNamara could solve the Golden State Killer case, surely we can help solve Darlie's case.
Michelle McNamara did not solve the Golden State Killer case. And Paul Holes makes that very clear that it
Right.
was the police that solved it. So you might want to reframe that.
Well, I
I mean,
think Michelle McNamara gave
she
them the
certainly gave them
leads.
something to look at.
And she also connected the East Area rapist
Right.
to the original Night Stalker cases, which happened in different counties and different areas of California. So Michelle was able to connect that and kind of give Paul Holes a new alley or a new revenue to go down when Paul Holes takes over the investigation, which he had been on the Golden State Killer case since James D'Angelo. Michelle McNamara had, like I said, connected the Earons, that's what they call it, East Area Rapist and the original Night Stalker. She connected Earons back to somebody who she believed was in the police department. And so after the unfortunate unaliving of Michelle McNamara, Paul Holes takes her body of work and then is able to go. They had actually exasperated all of the DNA that they had that Paul Holes had in his inventory. And so, because Michelle McNamara connected the cases, he went down to, I forget, Southern California, where the original Night Stalker case was, and they still had DNA from the case. And so, Paul Holes was able to get a warrant or whatever and sequester the DNA from that different county. And that is the mitochondrial DNA that Tara spoke about when we said that they were able to then take the mitochondrial DNA, they put it through genealogy, and then of course they had several suspects, or a handful of suspects that came forward. They then started going and collecting trash, cigarette butts, soda cans that these people were throwing away, and James D'Angelo, I believe, threw a cigarette butt or a soda can in a trash can. Paul Holes or his team collected that, and they were able to then match the DNA, and so then James D'Angelo was arrested. Just as we've spoken, I think that comparing this case to the Golden State Killer and how it was solved, I think does compare to the Darlie case. And I know we've done a lot of work. I know RPI has handed work over to the Innocence Project that he's done. So I do see a parallel there. And I think that's kind of why we used this case and the DNA to reflect the Darlie case.
Well, and it's still unknown because the court has put a gag order down on the Idaho State case. But if you'll remember, they identified his DNA. I can't remember his name. When Brian Corsack, whatever his name is.
Brian Koberger.
Yeah, and they went to the trash can outside of his parents' home and collected trash that said matched his DNA.
Actually, I think he threw the trash away in the neighbor's trash, so they collected.
Yeah, he was not, to be as smart as he was and gotten away with 4 murders that night. He sure was dumb about throwing his DNA away.
Yeah. Well, and we covered the Idaho 4 case previously, so if you're interested in that, you can go back in our kitchen table research episodes and go find where we covered what we knew at the time about the Idaho 4. It had just happened at the time, but we'll keep you guys updated as more information comes out. But as Joan stated, there's a gag order on that case and the Delphi case. One thing I want to state that's really cool about DNA, just connecting it back kind of to where you can think about it, is when mitochondrial DNA is passed down. So say when she was pregnant with myself, when you're a baby in utero, that's when women's eggs are actually created. And so my mother, who was carrying me, was also carrying the eggs that I had that later produced my child. And so actually, if you think about it, my mother actually had my child's DNA inside of her while she was pregnant.
Right, and that's called,
that's
called a chimera.
A microchimera. Microchimerism.
So, frankly, I'm pretty hazy on that because I cannot get past the science of that. But that is absolutely amazing that we carry our grandchildren.
Yeah, so you had Mikey you had Mikey's egg in your body. That's cool. That's cool to me. All right. Tara, do you have anything else you would like to add?
I'd just like to add, I know we spoke a little bit about this before, but DNA analysis is only as good as the crime scene investigation. With this case, obviously, as we discussed before, you only get the prosecution side of things because the defense didn't do any DNA testing. And I believe that, did you say Johnson?
Johnson, yeah.
I believe she was hired most likely by the original attorney, Douglas Parks. So obviously, if she was not then taken on by Mulder, then she would have no DNA results, or there would be no testing done. So, I believe that was a massive failure of them, but
Yeah,
also, yeah,
Yeah.
just my main point is that because people say, "Oh, but it's only Darlie's DNA and it's only the boy's DNA, so it must have been her." That's not how DNA works. So you have to actually, sometimes it's luck of the draw.
yeah,
Sometimes it's just about luck, that whether they pick up on that certain piece of evidence, whether they test that piece of evidence. Because, like I
well,
said before, you can't test everything in the crime scene; it's impossible. Right. So you do have to be selective at a crime scene when you're collecting evidence, but at the same time, there has to be sort of logical thought. As we discussed, they never took blood swabs from the utility room door and
right.
places that we know that the intruder likely touched, because we have bloody fingerprints there and hand impressions. So,
Nor did
um,
they really
so
use
that's
the
what I
luminol to its scientific potential.
They didn't check any of the dog or cat's fur. I mean, if there were blood splatter, I would have thought it would have been on some cat fur.
Well, and Jones is referring Bear, their cat, was in a kennel
And there
downstairs.
were kittens
Hmm.
in the kennel too.
I don't
Now,
know if the
Domino was
kittens.
upstairs.
Yeah, a Domain. Domain was upstairs in the master bedroom. But there was, at least I know, Bear. I'm not sure where the kittens were, but I know Bear was down in that kennel. If cats could see, Bear could solve the case.
Yep.
Or I
yeah,
guess I should say if cats could talk.
yeah. But also, DNA is similar to a fingerprint. Sometimes you get fingerprints, sometimes you don't. Very rarely do you get a bloody fingerprint at a crime scene.
To
Yeah,
us,
but
we believe that
in
bloody
in
fingerprint, it belongs to that
in terms
intruder.
yeah, but in terms of contact, back then, DNA was so it was
Yeah.
still very in its infancy still, early 90s, mid 90s, it was still in its infancy. So you have to think, like, they didn't have touch DNA back then. If they had touch DNA, things like that, then, maybe they would have found evidence of an intruder. But you've got to think how long a person was touching that item for. Do you see what I mean?
Well, and
Because if
touch
it was a limited
DNA
amount of yeah, if it was a
evaporates in
limited
about
amount of
30
time,
days. Yeah, so if it's not
right?
preserved, then we've probably, in my opinion, lost any touch DNA that was possibly even collected. I don't think that it would be testable today, in my opinion, from what I know about touch
Well,
DNA.
and I don't think Mr. Touch DNA put his thumbprint on anything for longer than half a second. I mean, he's in a
Right,
hurry.
right.
He's
This
trying to get
Yeah.
crime
out of
took
I mean,
there.
place in a
I
very
feel like
short amount
he
of time.
was yeah, this all happened very quickly. I mean,
Right,
people are like, "How did she stay asleep?" and so and things
right,
like that, and it's just ridiculous because it's like, well, she could have passed out, she could have been, but she was originally asleep as well. You've got to take that into account. And I think that, she was struggling with the intruder, but he may have only touched her skin. He might not have touched her nightshirt.
right,
I mean, all
right.
all that could have been he could have touched her nightshirt is his clothing. So do you see what I mean?
Yeah,
So there may
Yeah,
yeah,
not be much DNA left over.
right.
And, you don't always leave DNA, just like you don't always leave fingerprints.
right,
Sometimes at crime scenes, they find no fingerprints.
Or they find
It's
a
not
piece
as
of a
you
fingerprint that's so small it really can't be ran through CODIS or
right,
any
because you
type of
can't
database.
yeah,
Right.
because there needs to be certain, like, points on them. But I feel like the RPD failed a lot in this case because, like I said, the analysis of the DNA is only as good as the original evidence collection.
Right.
And
because
the
you
people
you get
reviewing
results
it,
from what you test,
right?
right? And you get the results from what you test. So if you don't test certain evidence, then
It's
you're not.
lost.
I showed this in a case that I did, my very first one on YouTube, on Stephanie Crowe. I mean, they took a lot of evidence, they tested a lot of evidence, but nothing, because they were trying to suggest the brother had committed the crime, but they didn't find any of his DNAs because they were looking for the wrong thing, if that makes sense. Just like in Darlie's case, they'd already made up their minds,
Yeah,
and
tunnel
so they were
vision.
looking, yeah, and so they were looking in the wrong place for the evidence from the start. What they didn't test was her blanket that was on top of her, that had defects through it. She'd been stabbed underneath her blanket, so she was lying in bed, but no one tested that blanket. And it's just like, but they tested blood that was found near her hand where she tried to open the door. But that's only going to show her blood because she's the one that was
Right.
trying to
She's the
get
one
out
She's
that
the
of
one
the
opened
that
the
was
door.
door.
bleeding. Yeah.
Right,
Oh,
right.
yeah, right.
So
She was the one that had blood on her.
it really is to a lot to do with the crime scene, the crime scene investigators and how they approach the evidence. He could have very minimal blood on him, and
Right.
the blood he had on him could have soaked through his clothing. It, he wouldn't have had to have that much blood on him. Maybe he would have had blood on his hand, on his dominant hand that he used. Do you see what I mean? But
Right.
he wouldn't necessarily be, like, dripping in blood. I don't know where people, I think people watch too many,
Yeah.
movies or
Exactly.
something.
Yeah.
Exactly.
And then another question they ask is, "Well, why is there none of his footprints?" And it's like, well, for one, we don't know because a couple of the footprints, we've only got James Cron's word to go on, and that's not very, like, reliable. So we can't really say for sure. And he never says how he discovered they were first responders' footprints, or
Right.
there's no,
And
he
doesn't
doesn't
Chris
say how he did
Brown
this
kind of overlay? I
work.
know he used some Photoshop and there's some controversy around that, but I believe it's in Chris
Right.
Brown's book where he does show that by the, and I can put these photos up, that by that utility door where Tara's talking about that the blood was left, you can kind of see an overlay of a footprint. Now, again, that's a little controversial, but that shows a possibility in my mind.
And, like, so also the blood, we know most of that blood was Darlie's from when she stood up. So as bloody as the crime scene is, it still doesn't necessarily mean that the guy is dripping him with blood,
Right.
because most of that blood was Darlie's. It would have been very contained. If you think about the cast off, and that would have been contained to that small area where Darlie was lying, Damon was lying, and Devon was lying. They was all, like, within feet of each other.
True.
Damon was even closer to Darlie, so
And yet people say, oh, but Darlie's wounds aren't that bad. She didn't lose that much blood. Okay, well, her blood is all over. And we did talk about the blood and her hemocrit and hemoglobin
yeah,
levels in a previous episode. But just because Darlie didn't need a blood transfusion, she was right on that,
like the cusp.
yeah, the cusp of needing one. But all of the blood that's around the scene is basically Darlie's because she's the only one that could have gotten, or we know she's the only one that got up and really moved around the scene. Now, there's some debate how
Yeah,
far Devon and Damon moved, but we know that Darlie went and picked the knife up, called 911, turned the lights on, then picks up the vacuum to use as a crutch, and then she makes her way to the
mm,
foyer as Waddell enters, and we can hear that on the 911 call. So, we've kind of already talked about all of
right.
that, and this just
But had
reaffirms it.
but ha but had she died, had Darlie died, you have to think of it in this way. If you look at the crime scene, had Darlie died, all of the blood would have been contained in that small area.
Well,
Right.
and I believe if Darlie would have died, that Darren would be sitting on death row.
Oh, definitely. Because they needed someone. They needed someone to go for, and I just feel like Darlie was like the easy option.
Right.
Well, and let's face it, Darlie comes, I'm sorry to say this, but with that breathy voice, she comes across as kind of a ditz, you know?
Yeah. Well,
Yeah,
and we have to
people have a
remember she
problem with
was.
her voice.
I know. I know. And we have to remember that Darlie was 26.
Right.
I mean, what I knew at 26 and what I know at 35 are vastly different. And how I would have
Right.
responded to this crime as a 26-year-old rather than a 35-year-old would have been quite different as well.
I think like all their DNA, all of the DNA that's been done so far, all it does is support what Darlie said, because there's been further testing on the nightshirt as the years have gone on,
Yes.
and all of them tests show that there's no more of the boy's blood anywhere on the shirt. I mean, that shirt has been tested to high heaven, it's been
Right.
absolutely
Well, and who knows with the
every
2024
inch of that shirt.
testing, yeah, with the 2024 testing that the Innocence Project has done, we don't know what they found. Again,
Right, we don't know if they're trying new techniques, or I
well,
also think, I don't know if you've thought about this, but I always think that if they do find a genetic match, obviously they don't just need one thing, they need things that link together, so that it's the best for you to have things to link together. So if you can show that this person's palm print was on the inside of the window screen, which we know they pulled palm prints and fingerprints from inside the window screen, and at trial, Chris Frosch, the second in command, touched that very area in a demonstration every time he went through the screen. He
Right.
touched the same area, and it's on record. So I believe that, if I'm hoping that if they find DNA from either the sock or the nightshirt, then they would be able to sort of be interesting to see if they link the palm print. Because I've actually seen cases that were solved as well, or partly solved by that kind of evidence as well.
well, and we don't know because Chris Frost took the fifth.
Right. Well, we don't know. We know obviously that because it's on record. It was in open court, and Mulder
Right.
made sure that they put it on record. But yeah, we don't know what Chris Frost knows, because no one ever got to ask him anything because he took the Fifth Amendment.
And it's very interesting to me. Why didn't the prosecution call Jimmy and Frosh up as the main investigators? Why did the defense have to do that?
Right, and they should have really called them at the beginning. It should have been the
Right.
medical examiners and then the lead investigators, surely. Yeah, and the defense didn't even find out that David Neighbours, the head of the crime scene, was going to testify until Mulder questioned Patterson. I think it's like three-quarters of the way through Patterson's testimony. Well, the testimony that he
He
did
did
give,
give, right.
because he didn't
Well,
finish.
and from a time standpoint, Jimmy Patterson was at the hospital talking to Darlie when James Cron shows up on the crime scene. So James Cron, in my opinion, I think James Cron, since Jimmy's not there, assumes that somebody needs to be in charge and it's going to be him.
Right.
I think his ego,
Also,
Well,
if
and
also
Patterson
Patterson's
you
was
not
you
here,
make
probably like, fine, that's great with me
yeah,
because that takes the heat off me. Kron, you take over.
yeah.
well, and
Also,
that's
you make a good point there, in the fact that Cron was basically the lead investigator, even though he was meant to be a consultant.
correct.
Um, he basically took everything into his own his own hands, and obviously Patterson didn't do his job
Right.
at all.
And with that, I will say that our next episode will conclude this season. Season 1 of Kitchen Table Research will wrap up the Darlie case. I just want to shout out another person that has recently returned to YouTube. He has talked about the case with RJP, who is the private investigator that we all kind of work alongside with. And his name is Tyrell, and he's with Real Whirl Podcast, like REAL space WHIRL, Real Whirl Podcast. And he has covered the Darlie case, and he has done a few debates against some of the non supporters, and he used RJP's work to do that. So he took a break off of YouTube, and he's now back up reporting true crime. So we'll see if he comes back to the Darlie case now that there's new information out. Not only go check out Mystery Maverick on YouTube and RJP, but go ahead and check out Real World too. His name is Tyrell, and he covers all different kinds of cases, and we kind of know him kind of. Our next episode will conclude this season. Season 1 of Kitchen Table Research will wrap up the Darlie case and have any last comments. And anybody that has been a guest on our show and potentially Darlie's baby sister, Danelle, will be on that episode. We also will touch lightly on some of the other cases. I know that the yogurt shop murders is still unsolved to this day, but there is a really good episode on People Investigates. We also found a family member of Kenneth McDuff that has reached out to us, and if anything comes of that, we will give you guys that information. No updates to the Las Cruces case. The Carla Faye Tucker case is basically closed. She was executed, although Darlie and her became friends while they both sat on death row before Carla Faye was executed. There are also no updates to the Candy Montgomery Betty Gore case, although I will just reiterate that Prawn is the one that identified the bloody fingerprint in the Candy Montgomery case. There are still women going missing along the border of Juarez, and there are continuing cases coming out between the cartel Texas border situation. So, although there has really been no, I would say, government agencies that have come out and spoke about it, we still know that there are murders occurring along the border since we covered that case. We stated that Moscow and Delphi are under a gag order. So, again, as soon as information comes out about that, we will keep you guys updated. Murdoch was found guilty of killing his son and wife, and the Stephen Smith case has been reopened and is now being investigated as a homicide. So that's a step forward in the Murdoch case. So we will again keep everyone updated on Darlie and all the other cases that we have covered. We've also been following a possible serial killer in Austin, and there's potentially a new serial killer in Colorado. So we'll keep you guys updated on that. We are now investigating a missing persons case with our team, which includes Tara and RJP. And if that family would like to speak on our podcast, we'd love to welcome them on season 2. So we will keep you guys updated, and our next episode will be the conclusion of season 1. We will see you guys at CrimeCon. We will be wearing our Kitchen Table Research t-shirts.
Black.
They are black t-shirts with red and white writing on them. If you guys watch my TikTok, which I am at Marcus the Bunny, my name pops up as solely on TikTok. You guys all know what I look like. So if you see me and Jones at CrimeCon, please come up and give us a introduction, and we'd love to meet fans and other podcasters out there. So if there's anything else you guys would like to say, I think we did a really good job. I would like to give a special thank you to Tara today and taking time and the time consideration since she is overseas. So thank you for making time to do this episode with us, Tara. I thank you so much.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you for having me.
Is there anything else you'd like to say, Tara?
Free Darlie.
Free Darlie. Free Darlie, baby. All right, guys. Well, that concludes the DNA episode. I hope that this was informative for you guys and helps reassure the stance that Darlie is innocent. And we pray that in the 2024-2025 year that Darlie will be free and back with her family.
Yeah. Thanks.
Thank you, guys. We'll see you soon. Bye.
John.
And fuck Brian St. John.